So much. Good morning, Embrace. How are you doing? Good to see you. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I've received literally warm welcome here in South Dakota. Couldn't believe how humid it was when I walked out of the door this morning. Something to do with the crops that you guys grow here, they tell me. But wonderful to be here at Embrace this morning. I'm here with my wife, Lucy. We've left the kids behind this time, but this is just a picture of our family. We have 4 children. The oldest, Noah, in the hat, is actually engaged to Phoebe in the white top. So they're getting married in September, which we're just thrilled about. But it's wonderful to be here, and we have some wonderful friends here at Embrace, Dan and Marie LaRocque, who some of you may know, and we're being hosted by them while we're here, really enjoying spending some time in this part of the state. So thank you for the welcome. My name's Justin. I've been working in creating conversations on faith for pretty much all my adult working life, on radio, podcast, video, bringing 2 sides together, often Christians and non-Christians, for dialogue and debate. And this morning, I want to tell you about something called the surprising rebirth of belief in God. What's happening in our culture right now, and how we, the church, can be leaning into what God is doing, a new thing that God is doing in our time. I wrote a book on this called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It's going to be available actually after the service this morning. But I begin the book by quoting from a poem by a poet called Matthew Arnold. He was a Victorian poet 150 years ago, and he had a famous poem called Dover Beach, and a very famous stanza from that poem. It goes like this: "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." I'm going to begin by depressing you this morning, Embrace, okay? This melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. In his day, Matthew Arnold saw that even though there were a lot of people attending church, there was this Victorian revival going on around him, actually he could see that science and secularism were actually driving faith out of the public square, even then. And he said, this sea of faith is going out. It's going out on the tide. And fast forward 150 years to our day, and you could say that Matthew Arnold called it. Because where I come from, in the UK, there has been a steep decline in church-going, in people calling themselves Christian. At the last census, less than half the population described themselves as Christian. And even here in America, there's been a rise of the nones, the N-O-N-E-S, nuns, those who say they have no religious inclination or faith. So the question is, did Matthew Arnold call it 150 years ago? Are we seeing the inevitable decline and extinction in the end of Christian faith? A lot of people have said that's where we're heading. But I think there's a different story to be told. And I want to introduce you to a fascinating thing that's happening in our culture at the moment. I really first began to think about this when I met an interesting thinker called Douglas Murray. He's a UK thinker, a kind of cultural intellectual. He's associate editor of The Spectator magazine. And I had him in conversation with a theologian, and they were talking about the idea of Christianity going out on the tide. And he quoted this famous quote from Matthew Arnold about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And he said this to me, he said, "Justin, the thing about the sea of faith is, it could come back in again. After all, that is the point of tides." And he said this as someone who describes himself as a Christian atheist. Now, that may sound like a contradiction in terms, but what it means is this: Douglas Murray does not believe in Christianity, in the supernatural claims of Christianity, and yet he also recognizes that he has been completely shaped by the Christian story as a modern 21st century Western person. And he'd also come to recognize that we really can't live without the Christian story at some level in our culture. And he was noticing more and more other secular intellectuals saying the same thing. And on top of this, he was also seeing some surprising examples of his contemporary peers, thinking, intelligent 21st century people who were embracing Christianity, embracing faith. Some surprising converts to Christianity among his peer group. And he said to me, perhaps, Justin, we're seeing a turning of the tide. This sea of faith that's been going out on the West for the last 150 years, maybe we're starting to see a change. And I agree with Douglas Murray on this. I think something has changed because I've been hosting faith debate conversations on radio, podcast, and video for over 20 years now. And I began hosting these conversations way back in the mid-2000s at the height of something called New Atheism. And there were 4 gentlemen who were at the center of this so-called New Atheism. They're here on the screen. From left to right, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, the so-called 4 horsemen of the New Atheism. Each of them was a secular thinker, a scientist, a journalist, a philosopher, who was saying to their wide audiences, we don't need religion anymore. In fact, religion's not only false, but it's bad for us. Each of them had their own best-selling anti-God book. Perhaps best known is Richard Dawkins' book on the left, called The God Delusion. Sold millions of copies around the world. And they stood on stages all over the world at atheist conferences delivering this message. We don't need religion anymore. We just need science and reason to guide us into a bright, new, hopeful future. But something changed over the years because I began these conversations with some of these folk, some of these new atheist thinkers who were very dogmatic about their non-belief. And we had some wonderful set pieces and debates over the years where we looked at questions of science and philosophy and faith and history and the Bible. Can we believe in a God? Is there good evidence? And in the process, I learned an awful lot, including the fact that actually there's a really good intellectual core to Christian faith, and that actually Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. But I also noticed something else. As the years went on, the conversations changed. I noticed that these new atheists, these brash new atheist figures who were very dogmatic in their non-belief, that their ideas started to feel a little bit old. In fact, I noticed a new conversation beginning. I noticed that although they said that science and reason were the way to understand ourselves and the future, in fact, science and reason are good for some things, but they won't tell you what you're worth. They won't tell you what your meaning or your purpose or your identity is. That's not what they're for. And I noticed that the movement itself began to unravel internally for all kinds of interesting reasons, which I spell out in the book and in a podcast series. But I noticed that people's questions, who am I? What am I here for? What is life about? They continued to be asked. And in the end, I found that those new atheist thinkers didn't really have answers that satisfied people. And I began to notice a new kind of conversation emerging in the culture. It struck me most forcefully when I had on my show in 2018 a secular psychologist and thinker called Jordan Peterson. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He's on the right of the screen. And he came on my Unbelievable radio podcast show opposite an atheist psychologist. Neither of these people were Christians, but they were having a debate on whether we can make sense of life without God. And you would have been forgiven for thinking that Jordan Peterson was a Christian apologist, given how fervently he defended the idea that we need something like God to make sense of this idea of human value. And I noticed that the conversation was changing. In place of some of these dogmatic, dismissive, new atheist thinkers were coming a new breed of secular intellectuals, but who were very open to the value of Christian faith. They didn't dismiss it or berate it. They said, actually, are we losing something as we lose the Christian story in our world? It led me to write a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. charting the way in which new atheism had waned and this new conversation on faith had begun in our culture. And that alongside another book that I wrote called the Why I'm Still a Christian, are both going to be available after the service. If you'd like to get a copy, you're very welcome. I'll even sign a copy if you'd like. The Why I'm Still a Christian book is my most recent book, just published a couple of months ago. And that's really looking at all of the conversations I've hosted between Christians and non-Christians, atheists and believers, and saying, here's my case for faith. After 20 years of hosting these conversations, why I think it makes sense to be a Christian. That might be a book that you find encouraging or someone else could find helpful in their journey. Both are available after the service this morning. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is the book that really is what I'm talking about this morning. And it's accompanied by a podcast series as well, also called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. You can find that wherever you get your podcast from, telling this story of the rise and fall of new atheism and the new conversation on faith that has emerged in our culture. But if there's a Bible verse that I want us to think about this morning, a Bible verse that really sums up for me what's happening, I think we should go right back to the book of Isaiah, chapter 43, verses 18 to 19. And Isaiah, speaking to the people of Israel, says there, forget the former things. Speaking with the voice of God, he says, forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. God has always been in the business of doing something new. And it's often when things look at their most dead and desert-like that a new stream of water comes in. Revival happens. Times of refreshing. There have been many times in the history of Christendom when it looked like the church was on its knees. But God has a habit of doing something new streams in the desert. And I believe, even as we look at a very post-Christian, secular West, with decreasing levels of church-going and religiosity, I think we're starting to see God do something new. Streams in the desert, a way in the wilderness. And I want to talk to you about this in the context of some of the people I've spoken to over the last few years, some of these interesting, often secular intellectuals who are talking in very different ways today about faith and about Christianity. Let's talk about science, first of all, because science is often the thing that these new atheist thinkers used as a sort of battering ram against faith. They said, the more we know about science and the universe, the less reason we have to believe in God. But that's really not true. There's a very different story to be told about science. One of the fascinating secular thinkers I've had the opportunity to engage in a few times is Paul Davies. He's a physicist at Arizona State University. He heads up their Beyond project there, and he's a science popularizer. He's been on TV, he's written best-selling popular science books. And one of the things about Paul Davies is he says to me when I talk to him, Justin, I'm not a conventionally religious person, but I don't go all the way with my atheist scientific peers either. Because there's something about life, there's something about the universe that produced you and me that goes beyond just science. He will point to things like the fact that there is a beginning to the universe, that some 13.8 billion years ago, all of time, space, and matter came into existence. And the huge question that raises about why. Why is there anything at all? He's pointed out the fact that the universe itself appears to be incredibly finely tuned for life. When I was here and joined you at Embrace 2 years ago, I played a video in which I looked at the odds of rolling 76s in a row if you had a dice. And I said, it's a bit like that with the universe. It's so unlikely that you and I should be here in this universe. It had to be birthed with precisely the right properties in terms of gravity and the force of electromagnetism and about 30 or 40 other fundamental constants that had to be dialed so incredibly precisely to allow physics and chemistry and biology and you and me to ultimately be here. It raises a huge question about why. Why do we live in a universe that produced you and me? And then there's life itself, the incredible complexity of DNA. All of these things seem to speak of a design to life, of a purpose, of a mind behind it all. And when I had this conversation with Paul Davies, he put it to me like this. He said, Justin, the directionality in the universe, going from matter to life to consciousness, he said, I would add comprehension to that. There's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And he said, if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me comes very close to something like a meaning or purpose in nature. He said, I think that's a sort of religious feeling, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. And Paul Davies is not alone. There are a number of other scientists that I am meeting today who are saying there's something about the universe that looks like we were meant to be here. And when I hear that, when I hear about this directionality from matter to life to consciousness to being aware of who we are, I think of a Greek word that expresses that very well. It's the Greek word logos. And it's a Greek word that speaks of order coming out of chaos, of meaning coming out of non-meaning, of speaking order, existence, and life. And of course, it's the word that is used for Jesus Christ, the pre-existent Word of God, the Logos. He is the Logos behind life. And when I find the scriptures, in this case, John's prologue, the Word of life, the Logos who became flesh, coming together with the best science, I think something interesting is happening in our culture. That we're seeing this meeting of the intellectual, secular minds and the Christian story. But it's not just in the area of science. If you go to history, there's some fascinating things happening in our culture right now. There's a really interesting historian in the UK called Tom Holland. He's a best-selling author. He probably co-hosts one of the most listened to history podcasts in the world, The Rest is History. And I've had the pleasure of sitting down several times over the last few years with Tom Holland to talk about his story, which he talks about in a best-selling book called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. And in it, he tells his own story. He talks about the fact that he kind of grew up in a sort of nominally Christian household, going to church, but it never stuck. And by his mid-teens, any sort of faith he had kind of petered out. And he went on to have a very successful career after being at Oxford University, then publishing these popular works of history on the Greco-Roman world. And he described how, as he stood in the sandals of the Greeks and the Romans, the longer he stood there, he both marveled at the ancient world, but he also felt a strange sense of dislocation. Because the longer he stood in the sandals of the Greeks and the Romans, he realized how very alien their worldview was to his own. Tom Holland is a modern 21st century Westerner who believes in equality, dignity, compassion, progress. But these were not the values of the Greeks and the Romans, he discovered. Because the Greeks and the Romans, their world was a world where the lives of women and children were very cheap, where you could leave children, discard them by the roadside if they were unwanted, to be left to the wild animals or strangers. It was a practice called exposure and was completely accepted in the ancient world. Likewise, some people could be owned by other people. Slavery was just a de facto part of the economy in the ancient world. There was no concept of the inherent equality or dignity of all people. Indeed, some people could be the sexual property of other people. A senior Roman male could have his pick of anyone who was his social inferior. This was absolutely accepted. And it made Tom Holland wonder, as he saw these differences from his own worldview, he wondered, where did I get my belief in dignity, equality, compassion, freedom, progress? Where did that come from? Because it evidently didn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. And it didn't come from science or reason. Those are sort of value-neutral things. He realized his belief in equality, dignity, compassion, freedom, and progress came from one very specific source, one very specific person, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And the movement that he and his followers launched 2,000 years ago had completely reshaped the world in which Tom Holland now found himself. And he started to realize, my beliefs as a modern Westerner, they come from Christianity. The Christian revolution is what gave me my beliefs. And he started to talk about this in public. He published this best-selling book, Dominion, on this theme. And he's been reminding his secular peers, look, your worldview didn't come out of a vacuum. It came from somewhere. And he started to ask some really awkward questions, such as, can we hold on to these values that we cherish so much in the modern West if we're losing the story that gave us those values? Can we hold on to the fruits of the Christian revolution if we're losing the roots of the story that gave it to us? I started to notice more and more people like Tom Holland popping up, and I was bringing them into conversation with their secular peers. And they were saying, can we live without the Christian story in the modern world? Finally, there's a question of purpose as well. We've looked at science, we've looked at history. Purpose. How do we make sense of why we're here? And I think this question is becoming more and more acute, especially for the younger generation today. There is a meaning crisis in the West. A number of psychologists have talked about the fact that we've kind of lost the story that once made sense of us. Arguably, we once all did share a common story, whether we realized it consciously or not. And it was a story that said, you have a purpose because you were made in the image of God. And even though life is difficult and hard, that God came to be with us in person, to show us what life can look like lived in communion with him. And through his death and resurrection in the person of Jesus, he showed us that there's an eternal hope in the future. It was a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which you could find your place in. It was a shared story, a story that, if you like, gave us a common story to live by. The problem is, in the modern West, as that story has been sidelined, the Christian story, it's left a void. It's left a kind of gaping hole. And the problem is, we need a story to make sense of our life. The psychologists tell us that you need a story to make sense of your life. If you feel like you're just bouncing around chaotically without any narrative to guide you, it leads to all kinds of bad social outcomes, depression, mental health crises. And so we've been looking for a story in our culture to replace the Christian story. And people are reaching in all kinds of directions for a story. And there are stories out there on the progressive left around sexuality and gender and all kinds of political ideologies that some people are investing their life in. That's where I'm going to find my sacred story. And there are stories on the political right, political mythologies, where they say, this is going to be the thing that gives me a story to make sense of my life. The problem is, none of these stories match up with each other. And they all come together and they come in the clash of civilization. They create the culture wars. And as technology and social media has kind of ramped up these different stories that are clashing with each other, we're left with a lot of distracted and confused and empty people, especially among young people, where there is a growing mental health crisis because we don't have a story to make sense of life any longer. One of the people who I mentioned briefly earlier who's really tapped into this is Jordan Peterson. Now, Jordan Peterson is something of a divisive character. This Canadian psychology professor who rose to fame in around 2017, 2018 because of his sort of taking a stance against political correctness on campus. He's become something of a, as I say, a character who some people love, some people hate. What I noticed when I started to hear about this person was there's something different going on here in the culture. Whatever you think of the man, something has changed in our culture. Because I started to hear people say, have you heard about this gentleman, this psychology professor in Canada, who is drawing thousands of people in a huge auditorium for 3-hour lectures on the book of Genesis? And I thought, wow, Some preachers would give their right arm to be able to draw thousands of people, especially young people, especially young men, who Jordan Peterson was drawing for a 3-hour lecture on the book of Genesis. Why? What was going on? This secular psychology professor talking about the Bible. It was because he'd noticed that people need a story to make sense of their life. He was giving them the scripture. This prophet from outside of the church, if you like, was saying there is a story that can make sense of your life. And I've noticed this happening in all kinds of ways. Lots of other influencers. You may have heard of people like Joe Rogan, probably the biggest podcast host in the world, bringing on suddenly lots of Christian thinkers onto his podcast, even apparently going to church himself. All kinds of other ways in which we're seeing a rise of interest in Christianity. In my own country, in the UK, there's been something extraordinary just in the last few months, something called the Quiet Revival, a report from the Bible Society showing that rates of church-going have jumped enormously just in the last 6 years. From 2018, when they first did this survey, to 2024, they saw an extraordinary upturn in church-going. If you look at some of the statistics on screen, one of the most extraordinary things is that in the youngest age group, the Gen Z age group, only 4% of them saying they attended church in 2018. That's risen dramatically by fourfold to 16%. And it's even more pronounced among young men, interestingly. And I think what we're seeing is the outcomes of this meaning crisis. People are looking for a better story about life. The stories they've been told by the secular culture just aren't working out. Like I said, science and reason are great for some things, but they won't buy you a meaningful life. People get desperate enough, thirsty enough, hungry enough. They go looking for a better story. Now is the moment. God is doing something new in our culture. I want to end by telling you the story of someone who I saw this happen to in real time. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was probably at one time the most famous female atheist in the world. And her story came out just shortly after I'd published my book 2 years ago, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And her story is a perfect encapsulation of what I was trying to express in that book. Because Ayaan Hirsi Ali was part of the new atheist speaking circuit. Her story is that she was born in Somalia, and she fled a brutal Islamic regime called the Muslim Brotherhood. Escaping a forced marriage, she came to Europe, came to the West, and she became a political activist, but a very anti-religious one. She published her own best-selling anti-religion book called Infidel, and she became part of the new atheist speaking circuit, standing on stages alongside Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and so on. But as time went on, she found that she couldn't sustain her beliefs in meaning and purpose and identity in this secular worldview. So imagine how surprised I was when in November of 2023, she published a viral article titled, "Why I Am Now a Christian." And in it, she told of the way in which she had essentially been converted at an intellectual level by that Tom Holland thesis, that we cannot sustain our civilization in terms of its commitment to equality, dignity, progress, and freedom on a purely atheist view of reality. She realized it's the Christian story that gave us those beliefs. And many people criticized her, saying, well, this is just some kind of cultural or political conversion, Ayaan. But she also told, very movingly, in some subsequent interviews about a personal meaning crisis she'd had, how she couldn't make sense of life on a purely atheistic worldview, and it led her to a deep depression and to alcoholism. And she went through a series of counselors and psychologists trying to find a material explanation and cure for this depression she was in. Till finally one of them said to her, Ayaan, I think you're spiritually bankrupt. Have you ever tried praying? And Ayaan Hirsi Ali said, I can't possibly pray. The God I was raised with was a monster. And this counselor said to her, well, if you could believe in God, what kind of a God do you think you might be willing to believe in? So Ayaan Hirsi Ali started to describe the kind of God she might be willing to believe in. And she says that as she was describing this God, she realized she was essentially describing Jesus Christ. So she thought to herself, maybe I don't need to invent a new God. Maybe I need to investigate this person who claims to be God. So she began praying, and she began going to church. And in her own words, God completely turned her life upside down. She became a Christian. Just last year, she was baptized along with her husband, a well-known historian, Neil Ferguson. They both have become Christians. And if it can happen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the most famous female atheist in the world, I think it could happen to anyone right now. Something's happening. God is doing something new. And this is a moment, not for triumphalism, but it is a moment for a humble confidence, for boldness, that we have a moment when people are ready to hear. Maybe there's someone in your life who's been so turned off to Christianity for so long, but maybe the circumstances, the people that they're hearing from, it's softened them. It's made them more open to hearing this story again. Now is the time to tell that story with a humble confidence, to say there is a story. The thing that you've been looking for all your life, it's right there. It's still available. Come along. Come and see. I believe God is doing something new. Streams in the wilderness. The tide is turning. The question is, are we ready to meet it? If there are these meaning seekers ready to find a better story, are we ready to show them that story? By God's grace, I pray that we are. Let's pray. Father God, thank you that you never leave us alone, that you never leave us forsaken, and that even when things look at their most dead and buried, you have a habit of raising them to life. You came back. You were raised to life. You raise us to life. And you can raise this culture back to life. You can raise dead things back to life. You can bring those streams of water in the wilderness and in the desert. So Jesus, we give you this moment and we ask you to use us as we see a surprising rebirth of belief in God in our time. May we be ready to meet it with your story, with you. In your name we pray. Amen.